like to begin by reading you a typical reaction to yesterday's announcement of the resignation of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Quote, over the last decade, Prime Minister Trudeau has led with commitment, optimism, and strategic vision. The US-Canada alliance is stronger because of him. The American and Canadian people are safer because of him. And the world is better off because of him. Unquote. Who said that? James, do you know who said that?
I have no idea who would let those words escape his lips.
Joe Biden.
Joe Biden. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That makes in the same sense, Joe Biden has inspired the world with his leadership, and and America's safer and America's better because of Joe Biden. Yeah, maybe if you're from that perspective. But I understand that most Canadians don't share that particular perspective on Mr. Trudeau. I understand that his party is now polling in the low 20s, and the Conservatives have been the beneficiary of most of the Delta. They're now polling well into the 40s, which for a parliamentary
Mid to high
system,
40s.
which is a pretty dramatic swing. And in a parliamentary system, that could mean that next year's elections or this year's, gosh, I keep doing that, don't I? It's 2025. I got to get over it. This year, there really must be a new parliamentary election, right, at some point by October, right? And I understand there's been this huge shift. Now, the perception in America is, for example, that government spending is out of control in Canada. They're having unprecedented budget deficits. There's inflation, especially with housing and also stagnant growth. The last couple of quarters have gone from 2% back down to 1%. And when you factor in per capita GDP, there's been more stagnation than growth than in any period that I can recall in Canada's history. How does the economy play into Trudeau's resignation?
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So, according to recent statistics that I've heard, Canadians earn approximately like in the neighborhood of 55 to 60% of what our counterparts in the United States earn. And that's, calculating it in US dollars. And housing prices, so you mentioned housing prices. According to recent estimates, houses in Vancouver are almost twice as expensive as similar houses in Seattle. And the same thing if you were to compare houses in, say, Toronto with houses in, say, Michigan or Detroit or Chicago or somewhere in that area.
Oh, wow.
So
So there is significant
Canadians
inflation
are
pressure
earning,
now.
yeah, Canadians are earning less than Americans, and we're paying way more for everything, for housing, but also for food. And so now most Canadians, most young Canadians nowadays can't even afford a down payment on a house, let alone actually buying a house. And the question is, what actually got us here? Because if you look at the last 10 years, the Canadian political landscape in the last 10 years, Justin Trudeau's party has won the last three elections.
Yeah.
He won a majority in 2015. He won minority governments in the two subsequent elections in 2019 and 2021. So what got us here? Why is it that Canadians have supported this man and voted for this man in the past 10 years?
Years, yeah. Why?
Uh, And
What
the
is the appeal if the economy is tanking and stagnating like that?
So the first point that we need to make very clear is that Justin Trudeau is an absolutely perfect reflection of all the principles that are being taught in our public schools and in our universities. Whether you're talking about feminism, anti-racism, post-colonialism, he's the poster boy. He's the absolute the poster boy of Canada's cultural and intellectual scene. And now Canadians are scratching their heads and looking around and thinking, well, this isn't what we wanted.
Yeah.
It's time for Canadians to look in the mirror, or better yet, to take a deep look into their own souls and ask themselves, what are the principles? What are the ideas that they've unthinkingly accepted from their teachers and their professors that has led the country on this particular path? And you can always tell when somebody really understands politics. People who know what they're talking about focus on issues. People who don't know what they're talking about focus on politics, focus on personalities. So nowadays, people are saying, well, Justin Trudeau, he's the worst prime minister in Canadian history. He's brought the country to this stage. Well, first of all, he had, over the past, until very recently, he had the full support of his own party. And not just his own party. So in Canada, there are basically three major parties. Our oldest party is the Conservative Party, which is basically to the right of center. Then there's the Liberal Party. That's Justin Trudeau's party, which is to historically was slightly to the left of center, but which has moved so far to the left that it's basically become indistinguishable from the New Democratic Party, which is one of the newer parties. It emerged in the 1960s. And for all intents and purposes, that's our socialist party, the New Democratic Party. But the New Democrats and the Liberals are virtually indistinguishable. In fact, for the last couple of years, they've had a kind of a gentleman's agreement to support one another, implement one another's policies. There's really nothing to differentiate them. There's nothing to differentiate the Liberals under Trudeau and the New Democrats under Jagmeet Singh.
Wow. Wow. In my country, of course, the immigration issue played a big part in Donald Trump's election, in our recent election. What is the impact of immigration? Now, Canada has a tradition for letting in refugees from all over the world. I think one of the noble traditions in
Yes, and
Canadian
certainly
history.
my parents benefited from that tradition.
Yeah, yeah, and so many people from abroad who have been welcomed in Canada. Do you think that's changing in the popular mind? That is to say, there's been a lot of immigration. I understand that just in one year there was 1 million immigrants, and that's been kept
Over
up
the
now.
past few years, there's been almost
Wow, right.
approximately 1 million people coming into this country. Canada has a population of about 40 million. So Canada has a population that's what, about 1/8 that of the United States. And, on average, we're getting 1 million additional people coming into the country. So if you want to look at the reasons why housing is out of control, why, hospitals can't deal with the overflow of patients, and you
And,
need to
and
look no
so
farther.
the problem is the conjunction of socialist leaning policies with sort of a liberal immigration policy, and the two are sort of colliding as they kind of have in the United States. And are Canadians changing their mind about being so open to foreign immigration, to refugees abroad?
Well, so you're correct in pointing out that historically Canadians have always favored, a sort of an open border policy. Anyone, any refugees, any people can come here, uh, which which is fine. But the pressure that it's putting on housing prices, that it's putting on the cost of living, that it's putting particularly on our medical system. So something that's been in the news over the past few months is hospitals have been closing. Emergency rooms have been closing in various parts of particularly in British Columbia and Ontario. I'm not sure so much about the other provinces, but imagine that you live in a small town which has one major hospital, and the emergency room is closed for say a weekend, 2 days, 3 days, and the next hospital is maybe an hour drive or a couple of hours drive away. That's happening regularly. We simply don't have enough doctors and nurses and hospitals to keep up with the incredible demand. So very few people now actually have, or a lot of people don't have a family doctor. Like I haven't had a family doctor for years. So because of that, people are using emergency rooms more, even for small things that ideally shouldn't be necessary. You should just be able to make an appointment with your general practitioner, go to a clinic. And the hospitals are just so overwhelmed, and speaking of immigrants, we have plenty of immigrants who were doctors and nurses in their own countries, and they come here and they end up as cab drivers or janitors because they can't get a job, they can't get the proper certification because they were educated in another country rather than in this country.
Wow. And so, really, a lot of this is the result of Canada's socialized medicine approach to healthcare.
Yes.
And wow. Okay. Another another issue that has been keen on people's minds are, for example, how Trudeau dealt with the COVID lockdowns, which were dramatically draconian, and the way he dealt with those who protested against it. Now, I'm not in favor of trucks blocking bridges in the United States.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he seemed to bypass due process, freeze bank accounts, arrest people and so forth come down on people before they'd even had due process of law. Also, with regard to free speech on the issue of COVID, he was shutting down free speech. In fact, in general, on many issues, such as transgender issues at universities. We've heard, for example, Professor Peterson bravely fight. One thing I'll positively say about Jordan Peterson, fighting back on that those mandates on how you use language at universities.
Right,
So
mandated
Trudeau is
speech.
associated
Yeah.
with sort of authoritarian leaning policies. His party is called the Liberal Party, but a whole set of very illiberal policies when it comes to COVID, free speech, due process, as though he's sort of the authoritarian in the Great White North.
Yeah, well, see, I have a beef with the way people nowadays use the word liberal and the way they use the term progressives, because the liberals are clearly illiberal and progressives are clearly as regressive as you could possibly imagine. Yeah, I think what happened with the Freedom Convoy is a good example of Justin Trudeau's authoritarianism. He portrays himself as this very, very progressive, very, very woke sort of leader, but he doesn't tolerate any challenges to his authority. So what happened there was that the truck drivers were protesting the vaccine mandates to be able to cross the Canada-U.S. border. And to be sure, I don't approve of the truck drivers blocking the bridges and the borders and thoroughfares that were used by other Canadian citizens. But the gathering in Ottawa, I mean, really all they wanted was somebody from the Liberal Party, someone from the government to address their concerns. I mean, what happened when the truck drivers gathered in Ottawa? Justin Trudeau went into hiding. He basically moved to an undisclosed location. He refused to meet with the truck drivers, to have any dialogue with them. He badmouthed them through, he called them he accused them of being racist and everything because apparently there was on the first day of the convoy there was one person with a swastika who had absolutely nothing to do with the convoy, by the way. And one thing I have to stress is that almost everything that all of his worst crimes have been aided and abetted by the mainstream news media, whether it's smearing the truck drivers, smearing the Freedom Convoy. The news media has been pretty much in Justin Trudeau's pocket for the past 10 years.
And
And
so they've
that's
got this whole if you oppose Trudeau, you're a swastika waving kind of Nazi, which is kind of like the overkill against the Republicans in my country. Whatever Donald Trump's own authoritarian tendencies, calling him Adolf Hitler is kind of a turnoff. And when you say that all of his supporters are Nazis or something, it's kind of like when Trudeau said, "Oh well, all these protesters are swastika carrying." What was the line that Trudeau had? Swastika carrying whatevers. That
That's right. And
seems
then
a
he,
bit
he used
harsh.
those smears. He used those smears to justify invoking the emergency measures, which made it possible for him to arrest the protesters and to freeze the bank accounts, not just of the protesters, but people who supported the protesters. People who donated, who didn't participate in the Freedom Convoy, but donated money through GoFundMe or similar, had their bank accounts frozen by Trudeau.
Outrageous authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Outrageous author. So he's thoroughly mismanaged the economy. He has clear anti-liberal, hostile to free speech and freedom in general positions, and bypassing due process of law. Am I correct in saying that what we've assessed so far is the reason why his party has so dramatically tanked in recent months? And it looks bad for the Liberal Party come the next election.
But here's the interesting thing. Now, if I'm going to say something in defense of Justin Trudeau, I don't think he's ever deceived the Canadian people in the sense of presenting himself as something that he's not. It was clear from day one, for anyone with eyes to see it, exactly what ideology he represents and what direction he would take the country in. And that's something that Canadians don't want to come to terms with. The level of political and economic ignorance in this country is absolutely staggering. I'll just give you one example. So, cost of living, the rising cost of groceries is something that's very much been in the news in the past couple of years, particularly since the coronavirus lockdowns. And who do you think is taking the blame for that? Do you think it's the Bank of Canada, the fact that we've been printing monopoly money by the billions ever since the lockdowns? No, of course it's those evil, greedy grocery stores who want to make a bigger profit. They're the ones who are to blame for all of our problems. And one form that this took in the last year is the boycotts against Loblaws. That's one of our big Canadian grocery chains. They own
Yeah.
several other, like I think Save On Foods and Overweight and some of the other grocery stores. And there was, I think, a very successful boycott against them last year. I don't know exactly how much economic damage it did, but the significant thing is how the news media very much latched onto this boycott, and there's been virtually no principled intellectual opposition on purely economic grounds to the
All right.
claims
So,
that, oh, it's the
Vice,
greedy
just
grocery stores that are responsible for our woes.
just as in my country, Vice President Harris, when she was running for president, wanted rules against price gouging, especially at
Price gouging.
markets.
Yes.
And of course, inflation is to be explained by a sudden outbreak of collective greed on the part of merchants or something. It's that level of economic ignorance. Okay, since we do have a situation like that, let's talk about the opposition. Let's talk about Praliev. What does he represent? Does he represent something really better for Canada?
So Pierre Poilievre has been the leader of the Conservative Party for about 2.5 years. I like to think of him as, in a way, Canada's Javier Milei, but without the religious baggage. He's a pro-free market, and he says this explicitly. He's a pro-free market, pro-capitalist guy, and he actually says this openly. Like for that in Canada, that's absolutely shocking. So my impression of him is quite favorable. I think he seems to be the likely uh, front runner for the upcoming election. So the situation now is that Justin Trudeau, he announced his resignation yesterday. He's prorogued Parliament. He suspended Parliament until the end of March, supposedly to give the Liberal Party time to find a new leader. Which I mean, that it's a total ship of fools. We can discuss that later if there's time. And then probably there in at the end of March, the opposition parties will put forward a motion of non-confidence, which basically will mean that there will be an election, very likely sometime in the spring, probably by May at the earliest, definitely before October, but very likely probably in late April or May or something like that. So as you mentioned earlier, the Conservative Party is very much leading in the polls. And so it's looking very likely like Pierre Poilievre is going to be our next prime minister, which could be very positive, but let's put this in a broader context. The political leadership of a country can do a great deal to hinder or to help a country's development. But what really determines a country's direction is its overall intellectual culture. And so, however good Poilievre is, and however good his ideas are about economics and foreign relations and energy policies, he's very, very good on those. If he's opposed by a significant section of the Canadian public, the news media have been pretty much against him from the beginning. Since he became the leader of the Conservative Party, the news media have been trying to take him down. They've been smearing him. They've been attacking him because he's pro-free market. And how dare he? In Canada, that's just outrageous to our university incubated journalists across the board. So the news media have been attacking him. Very likely he would find the Senate and the judiciary against him. And many of the provincial governments and probably a large segment of the municipal governments who are sort of lean more to the left, would probably be against anything that he puts forward. So he's got his work cut out for him, to say it mildly. So however good his ideas and his policies may be, he's going to have to overcome significant opposition in order to actually lead the country in a good direction. What concerns me most, so there's this idea and there's this mentality in Canada that freedom and democracy are synonymous, that democracy equals freedom, freedom equals democracy. And if you're a citizen of this country, you have really one obligation, and that's every 4 years to go to the polls and vote. And then you just sit on your ass and let the government do everything, right? And what's going to make a difference between whether Poilievre succeeds or doesn't succeed is whether the people who vote for him, the people who give him a mandate, are going to continue to actively support him in the years to come, not just passively, let the chips fall where they may, but will people continue writing to their members of parliament to express their views, or writing to their city council, their mayor? Freedom requires an active knowledgeable, and actively participating populace, right? I mean, that was the original idea behind the American system. And I think that's what we really need in Canada. We need people to be educated, to be informed about the issues, and to make their voices heard. Because who are the loudest voices in this country now? The same people, the loudest voices in this country, the professors and the professional economists are the people who put Justin Trudeau at the helm. So we need sensible, rational voices to make themselves heard in this country. Nothing less will do.
So there's a paucity of intellectual leadership, let's put it this way, on the truly liberal or truly capitalist side of things.
Classical liberal, yes, very much
Yeah,
so.
I see. But you compare him and you compare him favorably to Millet. So could it be that Canada is part of what some have identified as a worldwide movement towards the right and away from reckless pro-immigration policies, socialist policies? In America, we'd say woke social policies, which apparently are just as alive and well in Canada as they are anywhere else.
I hope so. But look at our school system. I mean, really, from kindergarten all the way up to university. Our school system is a self-perpetuating leftist ideology factory. And so my concern is that this move to the right in Canada and elsewhere it's going to be temporary. But if Poilievre tries to implement some good policies, he encounters opposition. He doesn't quite succeed in doing what he's going to do. Obviously, the news media are going to pounce on him. They're going to continue to demonize him. Over time, the Canadian people might turn against him. And let's face it, the average non-philosophical voter has a pretty short-term memory. In 4 years, the pendulum could swing back, and we could have the Liberals back in power, maybe with an even worse clown than Trudeau himself. I hope
Wow.
I'm proven wrong, but I'm not sure. A lot of it's going to depend
Well,
on the
there has
Canadian public's willingness to get educated and to really learn about the issues and what has brought us to the state that we're in now.
It seems, though, that even in America, south of y'all, I've felt the louder voices on the right in Canada. I've heard them more. I've heard that there was pushback from the Supreme Court. I've heard there was a negative ethics finding against Trudeau. How does that all, and within his own party, he's had his finance minister jump ship, right? And so, how does all the push? He has been getting, in effect, significant pushback from opposition. It's just they lack the intellectual leadership and a coherent philosophy to do that effectively? Or do you think
All,
that pushback is a good sign that Canadians might be
all,
getting a clue?
Yeah, all the pushback at Justin Trudeau, it's all been very superficial and very concrete bound. It's always on certain issues, but never challenging his fundamental ideology or the ideologies that we talked about earlier, the socialism, feminism, anti-racism, post-colonialism. There's no real concerted intellectual challenge of any of those fundamental ideas. And that's really, I think, what concerns us the most.
I can't leave this conversation without discussing, of course, my own president-elect's comments, which he sounds like he's an imperialist who wants to gobble up as much of the world as he possibly can, from Greenland to Panama. But he jokes. I hope it's a joke about making Canada a 51st state. But in the wake of Trump's election, among those who were making pilgrimages to Trump's, palace in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, well, Prime Minister Trudeau was among those who quickly made a pilgrimage to Trump's mansion.
Well, it's interesting. So, in a recent interview between Poilievre and Jordan Peterson, this actually came up. And I think it might have been Poilievre or it might have been Peterson who said that Donald Trump can smell weakness in another world leader. And you've probably noticed that in the past couple of weeks, Trump has been making a lot of jokes at Trudeau's expense. Hence
Yeah.
his comments about Canada should become part of the United States. Should he, calling him the governor of Canada, the governor of the state of Canada. I I could definitely see Poilievre being someone who could deal with Donald Trump on his own level. Who I would like to think that Donald Trump would at least respect the ideas, the values that Poilievre stands for. But we'll have to wait and see.
Well, Trump has certainly threatened tariffs, especially if Canada doesn't get their act together on the border or whatever,
Yeah.
however he puts it. We need better border controls. Are you all going to get one of Trump's? And of course, for
And
me,
that which will harm both countries. It'll end up harming both
I
countries.
believe so. I believe so. Of course, Canada being the smaller population and the smaller economy, they are relatively in a weaker position, unfortunately, vis-a-vis Trump's bullying and bluster on the threat of imposing tariffs on an ally seems very ill-advised and immoral from my perspective and from an objectivist perspective. Nonetheless, what kind of pressure does that put on Canadian politics when Trump threatens a tariff if Canada doesn't, quote, get its act together, or however Trump puts it?
Well, it could certainly be very damaging, but look, there's so many problems, even just within Canada, within Justin Trudeau's attitude to the energy sector, particularly what's been going on in the province of Alberta. They've got so much natural gas, so much. We could do so much. We could be selling natural gas to Japan, to Europe. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we don't need the United States. We certainly do need a good relationship and a good partnership with the United States. But there's so much that Trudeau's environmentalist ideology, his anti-energy ideology, has done more harm to this country than any Trump tariffs could possibly do. But let's just quickly check in with Daniel. Are there any announcements, any super chats, or any other comments?
We have a super chat from Bonnie, thank you so much. A super chat from Jonathan, thank you so much, and a super chat from Jeff, thank you so much. He says, "Hopefully, when the conservatives gain control, we can repeal the C-18 bill that caused Facebook to stop allowing us to share news articles on their platform."
Things
Absolutely.
like that shock Americans, honestly, Nicholas. How do Canadians, I mean, Jeff, bless his heart, I know where he's coming from, but does he really represent Canadians in this respect?
Canadians have been much too complacent on the whole subject of freedom of speech. And in this respect, I think Americans are a little bit better because Americans, when they sense a threat to intellectual freedom, they tend to be a little bit more vocal. Canadians have been a little bit too gentle and too polite, and as long it's yeah, we accept too many trespasses. Again, we mentioned Trudeau's reaction to the Freedom Convoy, but also there's this online harms bill, which would put a lot of restrictions on social media companies and tech companies. Yeah, we're moving in a very, very bad direction.
So you agree with Jeff, though, that the conservatives are likely to take control next year or this year? Boy, I'm going to be signing my
Yes.
checks 2024 for the
Yeah.
next 6
The
months.
one thing that I'm looking forward to most, Pierre Poilievre has said that he's going to defund the CBC. The CBC is kind of like our equivalent of the BBC. It's garbage. It's government subsidized garbage. And of course, this is probably one of the reasons why the news media are so eager to attack him and to discredit him. But I mean, if he could defund the CBC, how awesome would that be?
Yeah.
So, James, thank you very much for this conversation. I look forward to coming back in the months ahead and keeping the viewers of this channel updated on what's going on in Canada.
We got to have you back for as updates continue. But it looks like there's an important election coming up later this year, maybe spring or even summer. So,
Sooner the
um,
better. The sooner the
yeah,
better.
exactly.
Let's hope
Let's
for the
keep our
best.
fingers crossed and we'll have you back. Thank you, Nicholas. Always great to have the perspective of a smart Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Just quickly, we also have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. He says this episode is ARCUK at its best. Thanks. Thank you so much for your super chat and kind words. And also, we have the reality show coming up, UK's cover up of the grooming gang. So make sure to check out that on the reality show in just about a minute or so. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. See you guys
Thank you,
soon.
Nicholas.